It was supposed to be an ordinary family dinner at Cracker Barrel, the kind of place where children laugh over chicken tenders and parents steal bites of each other's cornbread. But within minutes, it turned into a bloodbath that stunned an entire community. A mother was murdered in cold blood, right in front of her family. What would you do if the person you trusted most suddenly turned into your killer at the dinner table? Picture this. Families around you enjoying their meals, the warm glow of rustic decorations on the walls, the gentle hum of conversation mixing with the clatter of silverware. Now imagine that peaceful scene shattered by screams, blood, and the unthinkable sight of a husband killing his wife while their children watched in horror. This is not just a story about murder. It's about betrayal, obsession, and how a quiet meal became a night of horror that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. The woman who died that night had no idea she was sitting down to her last meal, sharing a table with the man who would end her life. Sarah Michelle Brooks was the kind of mother who packed extra snacks in her children's lunchboxes and never forgot to tell them she loved them before school. At 34, she worked as a dental hygienist in their small Tennessee town, known for her gentle touch with nervous patients and her infectious laugh that could brighten even the most anxious child's day. Sarah had met David Brooks 12 years earlier at a church youth group gathering. He was charming then, tall, with kind eyes and a smile that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. They married young, had their first child, Emma, within 2 years, followed by their son Jake 3 years later. From the outside, they looked like the perfect American family. Sarah devoted herself to creating a warm home. She baked cookies for school fundraisers, coached Emma's softball team on weekends, and never missed one of Jake's soccer games. Her friends described her as selfless to a fault, always putting her family's needs before her own. She had dreams of going back to school to become a nurse practitioner, but those dreams kept getting pushed aside for more immediate family needs. The Brooks family lived in a modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Street, with a white picket fence that Sarah had insisted on painting herself. She grew tomatoes in the backyard and had a special spot on the kitchen windowsill where she kept her collection of small succulents that the children had given her for various holidays. But behind the smiles and the carefully maintained facade, there were secrets waiting to explode. October 15 started like countless other Saturdays for the Brooks family. Sarah had spent the morning at Emma's softball game, cheering from the sidelines while David sat silently in his lawn chair, occasionally glancing at his phone. Jake had practice later, which meant the afternoon would be spent shuttling between activities, the normal chaos of family life that Sarah had long ago learned to orchestrate with military precision. By 5 o'clock, everyone was tired and hungry. "Let's just go to Cracker Barrel," Sarah suggested, knowing the kids loved the games on the table and David enjoyed their meatloaf special. It seemed like the perfect solution to end a busy day. The Cracker Barrel on Highway 96 was bustling with the usual Saturday evening crowd. Families filled the dining room, children colored while waiting for their meals, and elderly couples shared quiet conversations over coffee. The warm lighting cast a golden glow over the rustic decorations, creating an atmosphere of comfort and tradition. The Brooks family was seated at table 12, a corner booth with a view of the fireplace. Sarah slid in first, with 8-year-old Jake bouncing beside her. 11-year-old Emma sat across from her mother, while David took the seat at the end of the table. The hostess, a cheerful teenager named Melissa, handed out menus and crayons for the kids. "Can I get the pancakes for dinner?" Jake asked, his eyes lighting up at the prospect of breakfast food after dark. "It's Saturday," Sarah said with a smile. "I think we can make an exception." Emma was quieter than usual, still disappointed that her team had lost that morning's game. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Next week, sweetheart. You played beautifully today." David said nothing, his jaw clenched as he studied the menu he could probably recite from memory. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by Jake's chatter about his upcoming soccer tournament and the sound of other families enjoying their meals around them. Their server, Patricia, had worked at this Cracker Barrel for 6 years. She prided herself on reading her customers, knowing when to chat and when to give family space. Something about the man at table 12 made her uneasy, though she couldn't put her finger on what exactly bothered her about him. No one at the table knew that one of them was planning something deadly. The Brooks marriage had been deteriorating for months, though Sarah had tried desperately to keep the family together. What started as minor disagreements about money and household responsibilities had escalated into something much darker. David had lost his job at the auto parts store 6 months earlier, and the rejection letters from potential employers were piling up on his desk, unopened. Sarah had picked up extra shifts at the dental office, working longer hours to keep their heads above water. She never complained, never made David feel guilty about being unemployed, but her quiet strength seemed to enrage him rather than comfort him. He began to see her success as a personal attack on his masculinity, her independence as a threat to his authority as head of the household. Friends who knew the couple noticed changes in David's behavior over the past year. Tom Martinez, David's former co-worker, remembered how David used to talk about Sarah with pride and affection. But lately, those conversations had taken a darker turn. He started saying things that didn't sit right. Tom would later tell investigators, like how Sarah thought she was better than him, how she was trying to control everything. I told him that wasn't the Sarah I knew, but he wouldn't listen. It was like he was building up this narrative in his head that justified his anger. The arguments at home had grown more frequent and more intense. David accused Sarah of emasculating him, of turning the children against him, of planning to leave him for someone more successful. Sarah tried couples counseling, but David refused to participate. She suggested individual therapy for him, which only made him angrier. "You think I'm crazy?" he had shouted just 2 weeks before that Saturday dinner. "You think there's something wrong with me? Maybe the problem is you, Sarah. Maybe you're the one who's destroying this family." The children had started spending more time in their rooms, instinctively avoiding the tension that seemed to fill every corner of their house. Emma began having nightmares, while Jake started wetting the bed again, something he hadn't done in years. Sarah made excuses for their father's behavior, trying to shield them from the growing storm that was consuming their marriage. David had begun keeping a journal, pages filled with increasingly paranoid thoughts about Sarah's motives and detailed fantasies about what he would do if she ever tried to leave him. He wrote about feeling invisible, powerless, consumed by a rage that seemed to grow stronger every day. The final entry, written the morning of October 15th, contained a single chilling sentence. "Today, everything changes." Friends noticed his temper getting shorter, his responses more aggressive, but no one imagined how far it would go. Patricia approached table 12 with her notepad ready, trying to maintain her usual cheerful demeanor despite the obvious tension. Sarah ordered her typical grilled chicken salad. Jake got his coveted pancakes, and Emma asked for chicken tenders with extra honey mustard. David ordered the meatloaf special, his voice flat and mechanical. As Patricia walked away, Sarah attempted to lighten the mood. "Remember when Jake was 3 and he tried to eat that entire stack of pancakes by himself?" she said, reaching over to ruffle her son's hair. "You were so determined, weren't you, buddy?" Jake giggled at the memory, syrup already sticky on his fingers from the small container he was opening. Emma managed a small smile, the first one she'd shown all day. For a moment, it felt like the old days, before the unemployment, before the arguments, before everything started falling apart. But David remained silent, his hands clenched on the table. Other diners nearby couldn't help but notice the palpable tension radiating from their corner booth. The family at table 11, the Hendersons, celebrating their anniversary, later recalled how the man seemed to be barely containing some internal storm. "Emma's coach thinks she might be ready for select softball next year," Sarah continued, trying to draw David into the conversation. "It would mean more travel, but the scholarship opportunities." "With what money?" David interrupted, his voice low but sharp enough to make Jake look up from his coloring. "We can barely afford what we're doing now. And you want to add more expenses?" Sarah's smile faltered. "We'll figure it out. We always do." "No, Sarah. You'll figure it out. You with your perfect job and your perfect plans." His voice was getting louder, causing heads to turn at nearby tables. "When do I get a say in what happens to my family?" "David, please. Not here. Not in front of the kids." but something in his eyes had changed. Patricia, approaching with their drinks, hesitated when she saw the expression on David's face. Later, she would describe it as the look of a man who had made an irreversible decision. Emma and Jake had stopped talking, their young faces reflecting confusion and fear. Other families in the restaurant were beginning to take notice of the escalating tension at table 12. The normal sounds of clinking silverware and gentle conversation seemed to fade as David's anger filled the space around them. "You know what, Sarah?" David said, his voice eerily calm now. "I'm tired of pretending everything's fine. I'm tired of you making me feel like nothing." Sarah reached across the table, her voice urgent but quiet. "David, please. Let's just enjoy our dinner. We can talk about this at home." But David was no longer listening to reason. His hand moved to his jacket pocket, and in that instant, Sarah's eyes widened with a terrible realization. What happened next would shatter the peaceful Saturday evening and leave everyone who witnessed it forever changed. The gunshot exploded through the restaurant like thunder, instantly silencing every conversation, every clatter of silverware, every child's giggle. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the entire dining room froze in stunned disbelief. Sarah slumped forward across the table, blood pooling beneath her on the wooden surface. Jake screamed, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of his small soul. Emma sat paralyzed, her eyes wide with shock, unable to process what she had just witnessed. David sat back in his seat, the smoking gun still in his hand, his face eerily calm. The meatloaf special sat untouched in front of him, steam still rising from the mashed potatoes that would never be eaten. Chaos erupted. Families scrambled from their tables, parents grabbing their children and rushing toward exits. Patricia dropped the tray of drinks she was carrying, the glasses shattering on the floor in a symphony of broken glass that seemed to echo the broken lives now scattered throughout the restaurant. "Call 911, someone screamed. "Oh God, call 911. Tom Henderson threw himself over his wife, shielding her from what he was certain would be more gunfire. An elderly man at table 8 suffered what appeared to be a heart attack from the shock and stress. Children were crying, adults were shouting, and through it all, David Brooks sat motionless, staring at what he had done. Jake crawled under the table, his small body shaking with sobs. Emma finally found her voice and began screaming for her mother, reaching across the table to touch Sarah's hand, which was still warm but growing cold. The restaurant manager, Carlos Mendez, tried to maintain some semblance of control. "Everyone please exit calmly," he called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Use the rear exit. Please, everyone stay calm." But there was no calm to be found. This was a family restaurant where people came to create happy memories, not witness murder. The contrast between the rustic comfort of the setting and the horror that had just unfolded was surreal, almost impossible to process. A off-duty police officer, Detective Lisa Warren, had been dining with her own family 3 tables away. Training kicked in as she moved carefully toward David, her service weapon drawn but held low. "Put the gun down," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Put down now." David looked at her with what could only be described as surprise, as if he had just awakened from a dream. The gun fell from his fingers, clattering onto the floor beside his chair. But when officers arrived, the truth about his state of mind was revealed in the most chilling way possible. Within minutes, the Cracker Barrel parking lot looked like a crime scene from a movie. Police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks filled every available space, their red and blue lights painting the October evening in harsh, urgent colors. The cheerful country store that customers usually browsed while waiting for tables was now cordoned off with yellow tape. Detective Maria Santos arrived on scene to find David Brooks sitting calmly in the back of a patrol car, no longer the enraged husband who had committed murder just 20 minutes earlier. When she opened the car door to question him, his first words chilled her to the bone. "I should have done this years ago," he said, looking directly at her with clear, focused eyes. She had it coming. There was no remorse, no shock at what he had done, no concern for his children who were now in the care of responding officers. David Brooks showed the emotional detachment of someone who had not just committed a crime of passion, but had executed a plan. The investigation revealed disturbing details about David's mental state in the weeks leading up to the murder. His journal, found in their bedroom at home, contained increasingly violent fantasies about teaching Sarah a lesson and detailed surveillance notes about her daily routines. He had been tracking her movements, noting when she left work, where she stopped for groceries, what time she picked up the children from school. Even more chilling was the discovery that David had purchased a gun, a .38 caliber revolver, just 3 days earlier from a licensed dealer. He had passed the background check with no issues, despite the domestic disturbance call police had responded to at their home 6 weeks prior. Sarah had declined to press charges then, hoping they could work through their problems privately. Detective Santos interviewed neighbors who painted a picture of escalating domestic tension that had gone largely unnoticed or unreported. Mrs. Chun, who lived next door, admitted she had heard shouting from the Brooks house multiple times over the past month, but had been afraid to get involved. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my business," she said through tears. "But maybe if I had said something, called someone, maybe Sarah would still be alive." The children were interviewed by specially trained officers with child psychologists present. Emma, though traumatized, was able to provide heartbreaking details about the increasing tension at home. Jake, younger and more protected by his mother, had less awareness of the extent of his parents' problems, but could recall his father's angry outbursts becoming more frequent. Dr. Rachel Foster, the psychologist assigned to evaluate David's mental state, found him to be fully competent and aware of his actions. He showed no signs of psychosis, no evidence of a mental break from reality, she would later testify. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it anyway. Friends and co-workers of Sarah struggled to understand how they had missed the warning signs. Janet Morrison, Sarah's closest friend and co-worker, blamed herself for not pushing harder when Sarah had confided about David's increasing anger and controlling behavior. She kept saying she could handle it, that it was just stress from him being unemployed. Janet said, "I should have made her see that it was escalating. I should have helped her make a safety plan." But in court, what David said shocked even the judge who had seen decades of domestic violence cases. The trial of David Brooks began on a cold February morning, 4 months after Sarah's murder. The courtroom was packed with community members, Sarah's family and friends, and media representatives covering what had become a national story about domestic violence and public safety. David's defense attorney, Robert Klein, had initially planned to argue temporary insanity, claiming his client had suffered a psychological break due to unemployment stress and marital problems. But David refused to cooperate with that strategy, insisting he had been completely rational when he killed his wife. "I want them to know I wasn't crazy," he told his lawyer during a recorded jail conversation that was later played in court. "I want them to know I was in complete control. She pushed me to this point, and I did what I had to do." The prosecution, led by District Attorney Patricia Williams, painted a picture of premeditated murder driven by David's need to maintain control over his wife and family. They presented evidence of his journal entries, his purchase of the weapon, and testimony from witnesses who had observed his escalating anger in the weeks before the murder. Emma Brooks, now 12, took the witness stand on the trial's third day. Her testimony was devastating in its innocence and clarity. She described the fear she had felt living in her house, the way her father's anger had grown like a monster that got bigger every day. "Mommy tried to keep him happy," Emma said, her small voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "She made his favorite dinner and didn't argue when he yelled. But nothing made the monster go away." Jake, too young to testify, was represented through recorded interviews with child psychologists. His confusion about why his father had hurt Mommy, and when she would come home from heaven, brought tears to the eyes of hardened court reporters and veteran detectives. The most shocking moment came when David took the stand in his own defense. Against his lawyer's advice, he showed no remorse for his actions and instead used his testimony to justify the murder. "Sarah thought she could run everything," he said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. She thought she could make me feel like nothing in my own house. I showed her who was really in control. I showed everyone. When asked by the prosecutor if he regretted killing his wife, David's response silenced the courtroom. My only regret is that I waited so long to do it. Judge Michael Harrison, who had presided over domestic violence cases for 23 years, later said he had never encountered such cold-blooded lack of remorse in a defendant. It wasn't just murder, he told reporters after the trial. It was betrayal at the deepest level. A husband and father who chose control over love, violence over healing. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges: first-degree murder, child endangerment, and weapons violations. David Brooks was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, David showed no emotion, no acknowledgement of the lives he had destroyed, including his own children's futures. Emma and Jake Brooks went to live with Sarah's sister, Michelle, and her husband in North Carolina. The transition was difficult. Both children required extensive therapy to process the trauma of witnessing their mother's murder and losing their father to his own violent choices. The Cracker Barrel where the murder occurred closed for 2 weeks after the shooting. When it reopened, management had removed Table 12 entirely and created a small memorial garden in the parking lot where customers could leave flowers for Sarah. The staff, many of whom had worked there for years, struggled to return in normal operations in a space that had been forever changed by violence. Patricia, the server who had waited on the Brooks family that night, left her job and moved to another state. She couldn't stop replaying the evening in her mind, wondering if there was something she could have done to prevent the tragedy. The broader community grappled with questions about domestic violence that had been hiding in plain sight. Sarah's murder sparked local initiatives to train restaurant staff, teachers, and healthcare workers to recognize signs of domestic abuse and provide resources to potential victims. A foundation was established in Sarah's memory, focused on providing emergency financial assistance to women leaving abusive relationships and funding domestic violence prevention programs in schools. Emma, now a teenager, has spoken at several fundraising events, honoring her mother's memory while advocating for other children living in violent homes. The case became a stark reminder that domestic violence can escalate to murder without warning, and that the safest place for many women, their own homes and families, can become the most dangerous. In the end, a family dinner meant to bring people together instead destroyed everything. Sarah Brooks died because her husband chose violence over love, control over compassion. Her children will carry that trauma for the rest of their lives, but they will also carry her memory, her laughter, her warmth, her unwavering love for them. The echo of that single gunshot at Table 12 serves as a reminder that behind closed doors, behind smiling family photos, behind a facade of suburban normalcy, there are women living in fear of the people who are supposed to love them most. Sarah's story ended in tragedy, but her legacy lives on in every woman who finds the courage to leave, every child who learns that love should never hurt, and every community that refuses to stay silent in the face of domestic violence. What would you have done if you were at that Cracker Barrel that night? The truth is, most of us hope we would have acted, would have intervened somehow. But the real question we should be asking is, what are we doing right now for the women and children in our communities who are living with domestic violence behind closed doors? If this story has affected you, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Help is available, and no one deserves to live in fear.